There's a voice from 1929 that Wall Street desperately wants you to forget. A single economist who saw the greatest financial catastrophe in American history coming months before it happened. His warning was precise, his timing was perfect, and his prediction saved the few who listened millions of dollars. But here's what should terrify you about 2026. That same warning signal just appeared again. Not similar, identical. The exact same pattern that Roger Babson identified in September 1929 is flashing red across every corner of today's financial system. And just like in 1929, everyone is ignoring it. Roger Babson stood before a packed national business conference in Massachusetts on September 5th, 1929. The Dow Jones had just hit an all-time high of 381 points. Millionaires were being minted daily. The entire country believed in what economist Irving Fisher called a permanently high plateau. Stock prices would never come down. But Babson looked at the same data everyone else was celebrating and saw something completely different. He told that room full of optimistic businessmen that a crash was coming. Not just any crash, a terrific one. He predicted the Dow would fall 60 to 80 points. He was wrong. It fell 342 points. A 90% collapse that destroyed entire fortunes overnight. The press called the initial September decline the Babson break. They mocked him for causing unnecessary panic. Wall Street analysts dismissed his warnings as the ramblings of a pessimistic old man who didn't understand the new economy. Sound familiar? Because right now in 2026, the same dismissive voices are saying the same things about the same warning signals, and the mathematics suggest we're about to witness the same devastating outcome. Welcome to Finance Historian. Here we break down global finance. Just a quick reminder. Before we get started, smash the like button and subscribe if you love financial deep dives. Comment your city and the time you're watching this. I want to see how global this community is. Let me show you exactly what Babson saw that everyone else missed. Then I'll show you why that identical signal is screaming danger right now. Because understanding this pattern isn't just about protecting your wealth. It's about recognizing when the entire financial system has become a house of cards that's about to collapse. Babson's warning wasn't based on gut feeling or pessimistic intuition. It was rooted in cold mathematical reality that most investors were too intoxicated by profits to see. He identified three critical factors that made the 1929 crash inevitable: excessive leverage throughout the system, widespread speculation disconnected from fundamental value, and dangerous consensus thinking that had eliminated all voices of caution. Start with leverage. By September 1929, roughly 600,000 margin accounts existed across American brokerages. Out of a total population of 120 million people, that meant 1 in every 200 Americans was borrowing money to buy stocks. But here's the terrifying part. The typical margin requirement was only 25%. You could control $10,000 worth of stock with just $2,500 of your own money. The remaining $7,500 was borrowed. This meant a 25% decline in stock prices would completely wipe out your investment. A 30% decline would leave you owing money you didn't have. Babson understood that this leverage created a ticking time bomb. When prices started falling, margin calls would force investors to sell regardless of their personal financial situation. This forced selling would drive prices lower, triggering more margin calls, creating a cascade of liquidation that would become impossible to stop. 300 million shares were being carried on margin by the summer of 1929. Billions of dollars had been drawn from banks into Wall Street to fund these speculative bets. People were mortgaging their homes and selling government bonds to pour cash into the stock market. The speculation had reached levels that defied all logic. Stock prices bore no relationship to the actual earning power of the companies being traded. Companies with minimal profits were valued as if they would dominate the world economy forever. New issues were being launched daily, often for businesses that existed only on paper. The public was buying anything with a stock ticker, convinced that prices could only go up. But what Babson found most dangerous was the universal consensus. Every expert agreed. Every analyst was bullish. Every banker was optimistic. The Federal Reserve was accommodating. Politicians were celebrating the new era of permanent prosperity. There were no dissenting voices left. No one was asking hard questions about sustainability. No one was calculating what would happen when the leverage unwound. No one except Babson. This consensus created what he called a false sense of security. When everyone believes the same thing, when no one is preparing for alternative scenarios, when dissent is dismissed as irrelevant pessimism, the system becomes incredibly fragile. One shock, one crack in confidence, one moment of doubt can shatter everything because no one has prepared for anything other than continued success. Now, let me show you why every single element of Babson's 1929 warning is present in today's market. The leverage that terrified him in 1929 has reached levels that would have been unimaginable back then. Margin debt in the current market has exploded to over $1.2 trillion. That's not just a record high. That's a 36% increase year over year. The trajectory is accelerating exactly like it did in the months before the 1929 crash. But today's leverage extends far beyond simple margin accounts. The entire financial system is built on borrowed money. Corporate debt has reached historic highs. Government debt is exploding. Investment funds are using complex derivatives to amplify their positions. The amount of borrowed money in the system makes 1929 look conservative by comparison. The speculation Babson identified has returned with a vengeance. Artificial intelligence stocks are trading at valuations that make no mathematical sense. Companies with minimal revenue are worth hundreds of billions of dollars because they mention artificial intelligence in their business plans. Retail investors are pouring money into meme stocks, cryptocurrency, and speculative assets with no understanding of underlying value. The euphoria is identical to 1929. Most dangerous is the consensus thinking. Just like in 1929, every Wall Street strategist is bullish for 2026. Not a single major firm is predicting market declines. The average forecast calls for another 9% gain in stock prices. Every expert agrees that artificial intelligence represents a revolutionary technology that justifies current valuations. The Federal Reserve is expected to remain accommodating. Politicians are promising continued prosperity. This universal optimism is the final piece of Babson's warning signal. When everyone agrees, when dissent is dismissed, when alternative scenarios aren't being discussed, the system becomes incredibly vulnerable to shocks. And those shocks are building right now. The artificial intelligence boom driving current market euphoria mirrors the speculative manias that preceded every major crash in history. In 1929, it was radio stocks and new electrical companies. In 2000, it was internet companies with no profits but unlimited potential. Today, it's artificial intelligence companies with massive valuations based on future promises rather than current reality. Fidelity. International calls artificial intelligence the defining theme for equity markets in 2026. Goldman Sachs describes it as revolutionary technology that will transform every industry. Morgan Stanley predicts continued investment and rising valuations. But here's what none of them are calculating. What happens when reality doesn't meet expectations? What happens when companies can't deliver the artificial intelligence revolution they've promised? What happens when investors realize they've paid tomorrow's prices for today's companies? The pattern Babson identified doesn't just apply to individual stocks or sectors. It applies to entire market cycles. Excessive leverage plus widespread speculation plus dangerous consensus equals inevitable collapse. The mathematics are inescapable. The timing is the only variable. Federal Reserve policy is creating additional vulnerabilities that Babson would have recognized immediately. Just like in 1929, the central bank is caught between supporting speculative markets and maintaining financial stability. Interest rate policy is being influenced by political pressure rather than economic fundamentals. Fed officials have been caught in insider trading scandals that undermine the institution's credibility at the worst possible time. The derivatives market has created systemic risks that didn't exist in 1929 but amplify the same underlying problems Babson identified. Counterparty failures can cascade through the global financial system in ways that are impossible to model or predict. The notional value of derivatives contracts is enormous. When forced liquidation begins, these instruments can accelerate price declines far beyond what happened in 1929. Corporate executives are selling their own company stock at historic rates. This insider selling matches patterns seen before every major market crash. The people who know these companies best, who understand their true financial condition, who see the real customer pipeline and competitive pressures, are reducing their positions while retail investors continue buying. Regional banks are facing the same type of concentrated risk exposure that destroyed financial institutions during the Great Depression. Commercial real estate loans represent 20 to 40% of many regional bank portfolios. Office buildings across America sit 40 to 50% vacant due to permanent remote work adoption. These properties were financed with mortgages at 3% interest rates. Those mortgages are now maturing and need refinancing at 7 to 9% rates. The mathematics are brutal. A building that barely generated enough rental income to service debt at 3% interest becomes bankrupt at 8% interest. Property values have dropped 40 to 60% in major markets because buyers understand the economics don't work. When these mortgages can't be refinanced, owners will default. They'll hand keys to lenders and walk away. This has already begun with major real estate firms like Brookfield defaulting on Los Angeles office towers. Over $2 trillion in commercial mortgages come due in 2025 and 2026. A significant portion won't be refinanced. Defaults will cascade through the banking system exactly like residential mortgage defaults cascaded in 2008. Regional banks will realize massive losses. Their capital will be depleted. Regulators will close institutions that fall below minimum requirements. The pattern is identical to what Babson saw developing in 1929. But here's what makes today's situation more dangerous than anything Babson could have imagined. The derivatives market has created interconnections between institutions that can transmit failures across the global financial system in minutes. When Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in March 2023, it happened in 48 hours. Social media and electronic banking accelerated the traditional bank run into a digital panic that regulators couldn't control. 3 more regional banks failed within weeks. Signature Bank, First Republic, New York Community Bank nearly collapsed before emergency intervention. These failures occurred during an economic expansion. No recession, no external crisis, just rising interest rates exposing the fundamental weaknesses that excessive risk-taking had created. Now imagine what happens when the broader economy contracts and multiple stress factors hit simultaneously. Credit default swaps on commercial mortgage-backed securities have spiked 300 to 500% since 2021. Sophisticated investors are paying elevated premiums to bet against commercial real estate because they understand the collapse is inevitable. These are the same types of instruments that paid massive returns to investors who saw the subprime mortgage crisis coming in 2008. History is repeating with different assets but identical mechanics. The Federal Reserve faces impossible policy choices that mirror the institutional paralysis Babson witnessed in 1929. Political pressure from the incoming administration demands dramatically lower interest rates to support asset prices and economic growth. But lowering rates would pour gasoline on speculative fires that are already burning out of control. Keeping rates elevated risks, triggering the commercial real estate collapse and regional banking crisis that's already building. Fed Chair Jerome Powell's term expires in May 2026. The replacement process is creating additional uncertainty about monetary policy direction at the worst possible time. Markets hate uncertainty. They hate policy transitions. They especially hate policy transitions when underlying financial conditions are deteriorating and require decisive action from credible institutions. The credibility problems run deeper than personnel changes. Federal Reserve officials have been caught in insider trading scandals that destroyed public confidence in the institution as integrity. Vice Chair Richard Clarida traded millions of dollars between bond and stock funds one day before Chair Powell announced potential policy action during the pandemic crisis. 2 regional Fed presidents were forced to resign after revelations about their personal trading activities. These ethical breaches matter because central bank credibility is essential during financial crises. When panic begins, markets look to the Federal Reserve for leadership and decisive action. If investors don't trust Fed officials to act in the public interest rather than their personal financial benefit, the institution's effectiveness during crisis management is severely compromised. Babson understood that institutional failures amplify market panics. Today's Fed faces a credibility crisis at exactly the moment when credibility matters most. Wall Street analysts display the same dangerous groupthink that Babson identified as the final warning signal before the 1929 crash. Not a single major investment bank is predicting market declines for 2026. The average year-end forecast implies another 9% gain in stock prices. This unanimous bullishness is occurring when valuations are elevated, policy uncertainties are mounting, and structural instabilities are building throughout the financial system. Some strategists acknowledge risks, but remain optimistic anyway. They cite tariff uncertainties, inflation persistence, elevated credit spreads, and policy disconnects. But then they recommend buying stocks regardless. This cognitive dissonance between risk recognition and investment recommendations perfectly mirrors the intellectual paralysis that prevented proper preparation for 1929. The highest analyst targets would mark 4 consecutive years of double-digit stock market returns. That hasn't happened since the dot-com bubble of the 1990s. When professional forecasters become this optimistic, when consensus thinking eliminates dissenting voices, when alternative scenarios aren't being seriously considered, markets become incredibly vulnerable to shocks that nobody has prepared for. Babson's warning signal is complete. Excessive leverage throughout the system. Check. Widespread speculation disconnected from fundamentals. Check. Dangerous consensus thinking that eliminates caution. Check. The 3 factors that made 1929 inevitable are present again in 2026. But this time the scale is larger, the interconnections are more complex, and the potential consequences are more severe. The timing mechanism that triggers crashes follows predictable patterns that modern analysis has identified across multiple historical episodes. When all 3 warning factors are present simultaneously, market crashes typically occur within 12 to 24 months. That timeline puts maximum risk in late 2026 through 2027. The specific trigger event is unpredictable, but the underlying conditions make some type of shock inevitable. Potential catalysts are numerous and varied. A major technology company missing artificial intelligence revenue expectations, a cluster of regional bank failures, a commercial real estate default cascade, a derivatives counterparty failure, a geopolitical crisis that disrupts global trade, a policy mistake by the Federal Reserve. Any of these events could shatter confidence and trigger the forced liquidation cycle that turns corrections into crashes. But here's what Babson understood that most people miss. The trigger event doesn't cause the crash. The trigger event simply exposes the instabilities that excessive leverage, widespread speculation, and dangerous consensus thinking have already created. The crash is already built into the system. The trigger just determines when it happens, not whether it happens. The mathematics are identical to 1929. When everyone is leveraged, when everyone is speculating, when everyone believes the same thing, the system becomes incredibly fragile. One moment of doubt, one crack in confidence, one forced seller can cascade into panic that destroys wealth faster than anyone imagines possible. Babson saw this coming in 1929. The same signal is flashing red right now. The question isn't whether you believe Babson's signal. The question is whether you're prepared for what happens when everyone else finally sees it. Because when market crashes arrive, they don't announce themselves politely. They don't wait for convenient timing. They don't care about your retirement plans or your mortgage payments or your children's college funds. They arrive with mathematical precision and destroy wealth with breathtaking speed. Look at what happened when the cracks first appeared in March 2023. Silicon Valley Bank went from healthy institution to complete collapse in 48 hours. Not 48 days, not 48 weeks, 48 hours. Social media accelerated traditional bank-run mechanics into digital panic that regulators couldn't control. Depositors moved billions with smartphone clicks. The bank's stock price went from 267 to zero in 2 trading sessions. That was one regional bank during an economic expansion. No recession, no external crisis, just rising interest rates exposing the leverage and speculation that excessive risk-taking had created. Now multiply that scenario across dozens of regional banks simultaneously. Add commercial real estate defaults. Include derivatives, counterparty failures. Factor in margin calls on leveraged stock positions. The cascade becomes unstoppable. Modern financial markets move faster than anything Babson could have imagined in 1929. Electronic trading executes millions of transactions per second. Algorithmic systems amplify price movements beyond human comprehension. High-frequency trading can turn minor corrections into major panics within minutes. When forced selling begins, the speed of modern markets transforms manageable problems into systemic catastrophes. The derivatives market creates interconnections that didn't exist in Babson's era, but follow the same fundamental principles he identified. Counterparty risk chains link institutions across continents. Credit default swaps, interest rate swaps, currency swaps, equity swaps create a web of obligations that becomes impossible to unwind during panic conditions. When one major participant fails to meet obligations, the failures cascade through the entire network faster than regulators can respond. Consider the notional value of global derivatives contracts. Over $600 trillion, according to the Bank for International Settlements. That's roughly 8 times global GDP. These aren't all risky positions, but they represent obligations between financial institutions that must be settled regardless of market conditions. When panic selling begins, when credit markets freeze, when liquidity disappears, these obligations become weapons of financial destruction. Babson understood that leverage works both ways. It amplifies gains during good times and amplifies losses during bad times. But modern leverage extends far beyond anything he witnessed. Corporate debt levels have exploded to historic highs. Companies borrowed trillions at near zero interest rates to buy back stock, pay dividends, and fund growth that may not materialize. Now those debts need refinancing at much higher rates. Government debt creates additional systemic risk that compounds private sector vulnerabilities. Federal debt exceeds $37 trillion, with interest payments consuming over $1 trillion annually. State and local governments face pension obligations they cannot meet. When tax revenues decline during recession, when unemployment rises, when property values fall, these governments face fiscal crises that amplify economic contraction. The artificial intelligence speculation driving current market euphoria displays every characteristic Babson identified in 1929 in radio stocks and electrical companies. Massive valuations based on revolutionary promises rather than current profits. Universal analyst optimism about transformative technology potential. Retail investor enthusiasm for anything connected to the theme. Corporate executives selling their own stock while promoting artificial intelligence initiatives to the public. But here's what makes artificial intelligence speculation particularly dangerous. The companies driving current market gains represent enormous portions of major stock indexes. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Tesla, Nvidia account for roughly 30% of S&P 500 market capitalization. When these stocks decline, they drag entire indexes down with mathematical precision. Passive investing through index funds means millions of retirement accounts are concentrated in exactly the stocks most vulnerable to artificial intelligence reality checks. The feedback loops become vicious when selling pressure hits concentrated positions. Index funds must sell their holdings proportionally when investors redeem shares. This forced selling drives prices lower, triggering more redemptions, requiring more selling. The passive investing revolution has created automatic selling mechanisms that amplify declines beyond anything possible in Babson's era. Regional banking exposure to commercial real estate creates the same type of concentrated risk that destroyed financial institutions during the Great Depression. But today's commercial real estate crisis is structural, not cyclical. Remote work has permanently reduced office space demand. Companies that used 5 floors before the pandemic now lease 2 floors permanently. This isn't temporary economic weakness. This is permanent change in how corporate America operates. The mathematics are brutal and inescapable. Office buildings financed with mortgages at 3% interest rates cannot service debt at 8% rates when rental income has declined 40% due to permanent vacancy increases. Property values have collapsed because buyers understand the economics don't work. Owners are walking away from properties worth less than outstanding mortgages. Brookfield Asset Management defaulting on Los Angeles office towers signals the beginning, not the end, of commercial real estate collapse. When one of the world's largest and most sophisticated real estate firms decides default makes more economic sense than continued payments, the precedent is established. Other owners will follow the same logic. Defaults will cascade through the system exactly like residential mortgage defaults cascaded in 2008. But commercial real estate defaults create different problems than residential defaults. Office buildings can't be converted to other uses easily. Residential properties can be sold to new homeowners who actually use the property. Empty office buildings generate no revenue while requiring maintenance, taxes, insurance, and security. They become financial sinkholes that drain resources without producing income. Roger Babson's voice echoes across 97 years with mathematical precision. The leverage, speculation, and consensus that destroyed 1929 have returned in 2026 with terrifying amplification. The signal is complete. The timing is predictable. The outcome is inevitable. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with devastating accuracy. The only question remaining is whether you'll listen to the warning everyone else is ignoring.